All right, so with the recording running, let's start with a little bit of an introduction for those that are new to the meetup, haven't been here before. My name is Martin. I work as an Agile coach for a company called ProAwareness. I'm also a professional Scrum trainer at Scrum.org that allows me to teach a couple of wonderful courses, and among which the Scrum Master product owner. I have a background as a software engineer, so that's how my journey started. And I got first exposed to Agile in 2009, and that's sort of like snowballed into something bigger. And I'm currently heading up the North American US expansion of ProAwareness. Sorry, I had to mute somebody there. A little bit of background noise. And I'm based at the beautiful city of Houston, Texas. ProAwareness itself has been in business for 15 years. We have 400 professionals worldwide, 150 plus years coaching combined. And you can find us online in case you want to follow up after this meetup. Have any questions, you can find us on proawareness.com or LinkedIn. So for today's meetup, a couple of things are good to know. First of all, obviously it's being recorded. I will also be sharing the slides on the meetup page. I will do that either later today or tomorrow. So you are going to get a copy of this. And that's basically that. I do really encourage interaction, especially for this session. We're talking about how not to be agile. We're going to be talking about anti-patterns, and I just came up with like the 3 that I've been faced with lately. I'm sure there's plenty of others and plenty of additional suggestions. So really, I encourage you to speak up or share your anti-patterns in chat, and we can definitely talk about them for as long as we have the time today. So after this slide, basically, we're going to look at why are we doing this, right? I just want to contextualize it and make sure we're not ending up in some sort of bashing session. I want everything to be constructive. Then we're going to look at 3 anti-patterns I came up with: Scrum Master and the lead as a team admin, the product owner as the boss, and developers that do waterfall. It gets a little bit murky. Like it's really interesting how if you're looking at anti-patterns, that you cannot really distinguish like a single anti-pattern. They're typically linked or interlinked to others. Very cool. And then obviously your anti-pattern. So I want to hear from you. I was talking to Samantha. It was her idea to come do this subject. I forgot to reach out to her, but I'm sure she has some wonderful anti-patterns, and I'm sure the rest of you do too. So again, participation, interaction is really encouraged. And then we'll wrap it up at the time that we're done, basically. Any questions so far? Good. All right, so why are we doing this in the first place? So I strongly believe that anti-patterns can really help you distinguish that unwanted behavior in your organization, those things that you might have gotten used to that are actually not supposed to be the way they are, or not really helpful in your journey towards business agility or your value delivery. So really talking about them just helps you recognize them, right? And that'll lead to several things. Like it'll help you have those conversations within your organization. It'll help you food for thought. It will give you food for thought. It will give you an opportunity to reflect on what is actually going on within your organization. So by looking at an anti-pattern and then looking at your organization or your team, and keep it like, hey, there's a little bit of that in what we do. That's what always happens to me. Like when I talk about these things and start thinking about it, I'm like, hey, this is something we're actually doing. And it might not be like exactly the same as the anti-pattern, but it's always super helpful just to trigger the mind. And hopefully it will ultimately lead to organizational change for the better. And last but not least, obviously, it's fun to do it. As was already mentioned, like the pre-talk a little bit, it's fun to talk anti-patterns. Some are hilarious, especially if they're not happening to you, and some are a little bit more painful, I guess, especially if they're happening to you. Let's just keep it respectful for the purpose of this meetup. So let's start with the first anti-pattern, and I'd really love to hear if this is at all recognizable, if this is something that some of you are facing too. So Scrum Master in the lead or as the team admin, right? So Scrum Master is the center of attention at the daily stand-up. They're not even calling it the daily scrum. It's like you just have to be there. They give out turns, they hand out tasks, they make sure that everybody has had their turn, that they reported on their progress. What have they done? What are they going to do? Are there any impediments? Like the mechanical motions from the 3 suggestive questions, I'd say. They do all the Jira jockeying, as it's sometimes called, like the backlog management and Scrum board, and like Scrum Master's like in the lead. It's like the center of attention. So first question, before we like dive in a little deeper, like, does this sound recognizable? Anybody like recognize this? You can also use like the Zoom icons, or there's like a thing reactions to like wave if this is something you recognize.
I think this is very familiar as a transition.
And what do you mean as a transition?
So, you know, the young teams that are not very mature and they don't really run the Scrum, this kind of Scrum Master leading this kind of Scrum is kind of a transitional, where they kind of get used to the process, and then ultimately they can kind of run on their own, like people start talking and stuff, right? But in some ways, I feel like this is almost even though it's an anti-pattern, it's almost necessary for some teams because they just will not go. You know, they need to be pointed out and call their name. So, you know, so yeah, so that's what I mean by transition. Like you kind of go through this until they kind of get used to the pattern and process, and then they can just kind of be more automatic.
Yeah, I'd say it could be a transitional pattern, but I'm afraid to admit that I also see it as like a forever pattern. Like even organizations that have been doing Agile or practicing Agile for like 2 or 3 or more years, that this is very omnipresent within the organization.
And I think this can be brought up during the retrospective, right? That it's not meant to be like this. So that it's not that forever anti-pattern. So
true. Any other thoughts so far?
On some of my past companies, I've seen that it's not just the Scrum Master, but sometimes the product owner kind of becomes the lead. So it's sort of the same thing where the product owner is kind of telling the team what to do versus the team kind of being more self-organized.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's just getting them feeling more comfortable about being independent, as opposed to possibly this is the way they used to do it before, and they kind of stick with that.
Right. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And we're going to talk about the product owner next. Like that can be even worse than this one, I guess. I wouldn't even say that my case for the product owner could be considered transitional, but maybe. Yeah. So David, as you rightly said, there's like no self-organization here, right? And the bad parts about this anti-pattern are that the Scrum Master is not supposed to be the team lead or supposed to be the team admin. This is supposed to be carried by what the Scrum Guide now calls the developers. Lo and behold, why did they change that? And they should own this. They should run this, right? And just handing out turns and having everybody report their status or progress, like it's not even the purpose of the daily Scrum, right? It's get together, inspect and adapt your progress toward your sprint goal, because ultimately that's what you want to achieve. And this very mechanical, like everybody has to say something, that's yeah, I'd say that would be like a big red flag, and that leads to the team not inspecting, adapting, and they are missing one of those super important feedback loops that Scrum has, right? This is the inspect and adapt loop for the developers, and the Scrum Master hopefully should have only a facilitating role in this. And as Samantha rightly said, I mean, it might be an introductory pattern, right? If you start a new team with Scrum, you will have to take the lead as Scrum Master and like show them how it's done. And sometimes you might have to like ask people to speak up because you're not hearing anything from them like 4 or 5 days in a row and you're not really sure what they're working on either, right? You can land in that situation that you might want to like trigger them a little bit.
Believe me, I actually start the teams by just, if anyone wants to go, you guys can start. Like, I always give a chance for them to actually do this on their own, but they just don't, so I end up having this transitional kind of a phase. Yeah.
It can be very, very difficult, right? And in my experience, it does help to sort of remind them what we're doing here, like, why are we here? Because we're here for that team, right? They're not here for you. They're not here to entertain you as a Scrum Master or to give you anything. They're there to inspect their own progress, right? To work on their own sprint backlog, on their own sprint goal. And yeah, like I said, you can, in my experiences, it can be a little bit hit or miss, right? Some teams do pick up if you say like, hey, why don't you guys get started, right? Some of them need a long, awkward silence before somebody starts, but some of them won't do it. Yeah, that's probably then the Scrum Master getting the most awkward with the awkward silence.
Yep, I've been there.
Yeah, very recognizable, right? Yeah, and this should really much be discussed in retrospective as well, right? As well as a little bit of education on why are we doing this, and it should really be the developer sprint backlog. It should be their way to, in a transparent fashion, keep track of their progress towards sprint goal and the stuff that they're working on, right? Whatever they want to keep track of there, whatever makes sense for that team. It's not the Scrum Masters. The Scrum Master may help. The Scrum Master shouldn't dictate how to do it or how to set it up. There's a little bit of a nuance there, right? For certain dashboard statistics, you might need to do things in certain ways. So you could imagine Scrum Master speaking up if it's all automated, but it should all be driven by the developers, by the development team, right? Because they are the most important entity in the daily Scrum.
I think we can kind of add to the possible solution is that I think we need to create that comfortable environment for them. So making sure that they know that when they speak up, they're not going to be judged or anything. This is purely for Scrum, not to judge others.
It's for them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, maybe they don't speak up because, they may feel they're going to be judged or whatever the cases might be. So I think that kind of making the environment neutral and letting them know, I think it's also very important.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And a comment here in chat, I found out a number of ex-project manager that turned Scrum Master do this because that what the project manager used to do in the old days. And that's exactly my concern, right? It's like a forced daily status update. Yeah, but very recognizable. It can get even worse, to be honest, if you got hardcore project managers. Right. So on that note, let's move on. And David number one in my screen already mentioned it a little bit, same for the product owner. The product owner is the boss, like the team lead or the manager of the team. They assign PBIs and everything during sprint planning, hey, you're going to do that. You're going to do that. And it sort of set the workload with that as well, either explicitly or implicitly. It's can't you pick this up? Sort of that psychological pressure towards the team. And it's your manager, right? So depending on your company's culture, people will just say, yeah, we'll try to fit it in and just work their way out. And then the PO doesn't show up during any of the daily scrums or the sprint itself, when the team is actually doing the work. But they do sort of require email updates or literally situation I had last week. I just sent out a spreadsheet, said why didn't you just send me a list of your priorities in the spreadsheet that I've attached to all the team members, and then he'd look at the progress. And that was big red flag right there. We didn't do it, right? So we talked him out of it, but yeah, very bad anti-pattern. Why? No self-organization, no trust in that team, right? There's that hierarchy, the fact that the PO is the boss is an absolute no-go, right? There seems to be a lot of missed opportunities for collaboration, status reports, again, one-way traffic. So those emails, it's yeah, we'll just send you where we are. And then what happens, right? You're missing like the most important part of what, for example, a daily scrum could give you. And that includes like for the product owner to be up to speed on what's happening. They can observe a daily scrum and be truly aware of progress or any impediments, and then be flagged for help for after that daily scrum. And typically for these teams, right, they're overloaded if the product owner like sort of pushes things their way, or it's individual team members that are overloaded, right? Because if a single person assigns tasks to people, right, they can never truly properly distribute that workload as well as a self-organizing team would. So yeah, big problem here. So does this ring a bell for anyone? Like anybody recognize this?
I think my problem always has been is that product owner is not there.
Oh yeah, that's another big one.
Yeah. And they think that they're wasting their time. It's like, no, you have to be present to answer questions, and you have to know what's going on, if we're doing the right thing daily. And
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, completely agree. And that's so I guess that's also what I tried to convey with they don't show up during the sprint. Like they're just there for planning and then they'll pop up again at the end of the sprint. So they're almost acting like a stakeholder. They're too busy. They don't have time, right? They got management stuff to do. Like it's not helpful, right?
Mhm.
Anybody else recognize this?
I don't know which is worse, that they're absent or they're like acting like a boss. So,
Yeah, I'd say they're acting like a boss. I've had
no,
effective
I'm saying
teams
that
with
I
the
don't know
product owner
which is
absent.
worse.
No. From my experience, I've had both, and I'd say I'd rather have them absent than act as the boss because that does more damage. Like you can do a lot you can do a lot of self organization when your product owner is not there. You're gonna have to make like a ton of assumptions, right? But at least you'll be able to effectively work your way through a sprint and deliver potential value. Whereas as it's he or she is the boss and there and then just dashing out orders, there's like a set expectation that forces you to deliver a certain thing that might not be the most valuable thing. And that would concern me more, right? Because I don't want to badmouth product owners, but I have a lot of faith typically in development teams, a self-organizing ability to figure out what's valuable and maybe reach out to other stakeholders than I do having a single entity single-handedly dashing out orders and being sure that that's the right stuff to build. Again, just sharing my 2 cents here. You might have a different experience. If so, please share. Yeah, and in these situations, right, it's well, what I typically do when I'm coaching organizations, I tell the team members, just stop sending emails. We're not going to be doing silly one-directional updates. Like if a product owner cannot spare 50 minutes a day or every other day to be aware of the evolution of the increment, as it's officially called, right, then what are they doing, right? What are they here for in the first place? It takes more time to actually process and read those emails than it would to actually be there for the actual updates. That is, if you stick to the 15 minutes, right? And the obvious other ones are have the team self-assigned work. Obviously, they know better what to do than a single product owner. And the team lead part is quite interesting. I've seen various solutions for that one. I would say that the product owner should never be like a manager or team lead for any of the team members or the scrum master for that matter. What I've seen organizations do is like swap managers out between teams. Like they had like lots of managers as product owners, which doesn't have to be a bad thing as long as you're not the manager for the people in the team. You could argue that the time constraint that you would have, like product owners a full-time job, how do you have time to be a manager? But putting that aside, right? So they had like cross-linked their managers across teams. So the PO for one team was the manager for the people in the other team and the other way around. And then at least like took away from that, at least the imminent psychological insafety that was there got tackled with that. Obviously, they talk a lot to each other, and they're still a product owner. There can be some sort of secondary effect, but that wasn't really that harmful in that case. Yeah, always invite the PO to the daily Scrum. Right, product owner doesn't have to be the daily Scrum as per Scrum guide, but it's very helpful if they're there. A point that was made before by Samantha as well is that it really helps if they're there to answer questions and be aware of what's actually going on, rather than get that either secondhand or through any sort of email. I've used email. I could have used Slack. That's better because I've seen a lot of people do Slack updates as well as the daily Scrum. Again, lots of extra work for one directional traffic, which I'm not really a fan of. So. Any other thoughts on this? Any other possible solutions or things that you might have tried or tested out or recognized?
One other thing I saw on the product side is sometimes you'll have them promising more than the team can actually accomplish without kind of letting the team know, and then kind of saying, well, we already said told the business that, you need to do this.
Yeah.
You could potentially be considered the boss or not the boss, but it's more a matter of like, the team doesn't have a voice in that, and it's already been told, so the business already has the expectations, and then you're going to kind of lose that trust where the team then doesn't meet the expectation, and then the business thinks that the team failed when the team wasn't even involved in coming up with the initial promise. So those are, and I think that's where hopefully the Scrum Master can help step in and kind of look at the velocity, look at what is actually able to do, and push back on that.
I very much agree with the last part of that comment, and I totally recognize what you're saying, that implied pressure of like, yeah, but I've already promised the stakeholders this. It's like sort of the wrong way around. You do sprint planning first, and then you go to your stakeholders instead of committing to that first. But it's a typical like, sales has already sold this, so now we got to build this. It's like one of the worst reasons to do something because of a promise that was already made, right? Because it removes like all the flexibility you had, at least for this sprint. It's like, oh, the PO is already committed to something, so now we're going to have to do this regardless of whether that's valuable, because the expectation is there that we're going to be delivering this. Yeah, that's very, very bad, I'd say. Yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing. All right, so then to the last one, and then I really want to open the board to other anti-patterns. Developers that do waterfall, I see this all the time, right? I had another developer come to me like yesterday morning. He's like, I don't know what to do. I'm a tester, and nobody sent me like a test document, and nobody sent me like document this and document that. He was just like looking at his Outlook all day long and waiting for somebody to send a document on what he needs to do, instead of just like asking a team like, hey, I'm a tester, I'm here to help, what can I do? So yeah, they work in their own little silo, right? They work in their own discipline. Like, I'm a tester, I'm a BA, I'm a software engineer, and they just hand off their test. Like, I developed it. Now it's up to you, dear tester. Good luck. Here's the PBI. This is the Jira link. Just go test it, right? Yeah, that'll like turn into some of those tasks and PBIs that take ages sometimes to resolve. Typically span sprints, right? Because it starts somewhere with BA and somewhere with testing. And even if you get that done in the same sprint, because it's like within those little silos, and if there's like something coming out that testing that needs to be fixed, it's going to be sent back to the developers, right? To the engineers, right? So, and when does that happen? If this is the last day of your sprint? Exactly. It's going to be the next sprint. And it's going to be another distraction, right? So they're basically doing mini waterfalls, right? With no collaboration, no cross functionality in that entire team. They're missing those short feedback loops of like, hey, the tester working with the developer simultaneously, for example, or design and development work, or everybody working simultaneously for that matter, for as far as you can, right? It doesn't work for everything, but to a certain degree, you can do some of that simultaneous work. And typically working, like having focus as a full team on one or two or three items, depending on the size of your team, is always more effective than doing like mini waterfall, even though it's not efficient, but it's more effective, right? And it will really prevent a lot of the context switching, because just going back to that example, right? The developer hands it up, or the engineer hands it off to the tester. The tester starts testing for 2 days. then goes back. Developer has moved on to something else and needs to go back and refresh it in their memory, and it's not really helpful, right? Any developers, engineers here who recognize this? How unfortunate. That would have been a that would have been a good contribution. Anybody else
Well,
that recognizes from a
I
different
have
position?
seen this, yeah.
Okay.
They wanted to have all the requirements ahead of time and then do their work. But then because the requirements change all the time, work never gets done. So
Yep.
this is the waterfall style, right? And the whole point is to define that MVP and then have the MVP and then, build on that, and that's the iterative way of developing. But then they're not used to it. They're used to given this kind of requirement and then plan the work from that requirement. And yep, it becomes waterfall when all this requirement changes,
Yeah, and like changes are harder to incorporate, and very much so. It will take longer to incorporate them. To your point, so yeah, very very damaging. This right, and typically in these situations, teams are focused on tasks or product backlog items, user stories, whatever you want to call them, right? And they're not focused on achieving goals, because if you are focused on achieving goals, you typically automatically sort of self-organize because the goal is more important than whatever's on the backlog, right? So you sort of like shape whatever's there, whatever you're doing on a daily basis, to achieving that goal rather than just having that on there and working through that list. And I've literally seen this to the extreme. The day like two people like email it to each other, sitting right next to each other, and like literally no communication at all. Whereas it would be so easy if people just start talking to each other and just work on this. Say like, hey, I'm starting to develop this. Like, you want to work with me, so you can start the testing scripts maybe, or maybe we can work on that together and see how are we going to test this in the first place before I start building. Like that kind of collaboration, that is super helpful. And I really think it's up to the Scrum Master to encourage that kind of behavior in a team. And then obviously the daily Scrum is a magnificent tool in order to overcome this one, because that should be focused on sprint goals and not on work. And to the point I made before, right, with the Scrum Master, it's not about like what did you do, it's really about those sprint goals and what are we trying to achieve here together as a team, and how can we get there, rather than hey, like person X has not sent me the test script yet, something we really want to prevent. Any remarks? Any additional thoughts on this? Good. In that case, I want to open the forum for people to sort of share their favorite anti-patterns. And if you want to share one, just tell a little bit about it, right? So what did they cause us? What was the negative effect of the anti-pattern? What have you tried to overcome it, and did it work? Maybe you have an anti-pattern that you haven't overcome yet, but you do know something's wrong, and maybe we all can help. So yeah, who wants to share?
I have an experience where managers come to the Scrum Master and to the Scrum, and I'm okay them observing, but they just stir up stuff, like, oh, so what's going on? And they start going into details of work. I mean, it's not meant for this kind of long discussion, right? And it's going on and on and on, and the team has to sit there for like an hour or sometimes even more. I mean, that's not a Scrum. I mean, there should be a separate discussion for these kind of deep dive, right? But they would come to the Scrum and then start things up. Oftentimes managers.
Yeah, because like they have this mode where if there's a problem, they go into problem solving mode, but it's often not even a problem. Like it's a day-to-day, like how's it going, right? And
I feel like they're just being nosy, kind of, in a way,
yeah.
So,
Yeah, I don't do this anymore, right? I did this once and and I tried to tell the guy, like, please don't do it, but he was very insistent. And so we joined and it like blew up beyond proportion. So I'm like, never gonna do that ever again. Like that's I'd rather do like a fake daily scrum for managers than a real one that causes them to mess things up for the team, to
Yeah.
be honest.
Yeah, this is I would like to add a point or two. I have the same experience that the engineering manager who was new, who was very curious to know what's going on and learn up to speed of, they were not even just coming to the daily stand-up or the sprint. They were in our backlog grooming sessions. They were in our checkpoint meetings with the program managers, and they were literally kind of like coursing with the decision of the business priorities at one point, and which literally kind of like screwed up our PI planning, although we kind of like put it together. But it's just that the engineering manager, because they are who we report to as a product owners, again, what they were like hijacking. Oh, okay, in our sprint backlog, probably you have to have these stories first in the first sprint over these stories in the next sprint, kind of thing.
You were breaking up there.
yeah.
I think we might have lost her actually. Yeah, we're down one person.
Uh-oh.
Let's
So
see.
back to
She
the
kind
living
hopefully it's just like Xfinity or something like that acting up again.
Yeah,
We
sounds
do
like
that.
a lot of people had experienced this, the managers
Yeah.
stirring the pots. So,
Yeah. So anybody else had this? Want to share like what did you do to overcome this? How did you treat those managers?
I think sometimes as a scrum master, you kind of have to step in and say, like, some of these are good points, but let's take this offline and maybe we'll set up a separate thing to discuss these specific points if you want to, email them to us or something like that. But the focus of this is just for us to know what we're going to be doing today.
Yeah. Very good point. Yeah. Very well. Any
oh
other
yes,
things?
somebody put the story pointing. Story pointing is a very difficult concept for a lot of teams. They
Yep.
don't understand what one point means and normalizing it for each team. And I actually went into teams where they used the wrong pattern, the wrong way of doing the story points. And what happened was the manager kind of gave them a standard. 1 day is 1 point, 2 days is 2, like this, right? And it was so hard to correct that. And, even, it was a mature team and they wanted to go back to this day equals story point thing, without any regards to the complexity or uncertainty or unknown, right?
Yeah.
And I think it is very important that people learn how to story point, what 1 point means. And it's not transferable between teams because every team is different, but then it has to be normalized for each team,
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
well, it's even worse if it's standardized across teams. I see Manwai, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Some Scrum Master gives translation tables for story points to their managers, like this is what we're doing, and then you can normalize and standardize it and like totally annihilate any positive effect the story points might have had on the team, the organization. So yeah, it's a quick
and
way to kill it.
also, what I try to do is have them go all at once. Put up your card, the story point card up all at once, because they're looking at other people, right? But the whole point is trying to understand what you think this is.
Yep, I agree. So
how did
Khalid,
you win
did you
that
want to say
battle?
something?
How did you convince them?
How did you?
For the person that fixed the story point issue, how did you fix that battle?
Is somebody
How'd you win that?
Noisy
No, I
person?
think he's on the phone. That's
Yeah,
why
he's
you
on the
hear the
phone, yeah.
background.
Yeah, I'm asking
So-
a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I got the question. Let me repeat it. Put you on mute. There's a little bit of background noise. So the question is, how did you overcome that part where like with the story points where like people look at others? That's the question,
Yeah,
right,
so
Khalid?
it's re-educating, right?
Correct.
What each point means. And from actual starting of the work and, what, when it's done and how long that takes as a team. And another difficulty is that for some reason, every team has a different definition of done, which makes it also even more difficult to do this because some people, they do the coding and then they consider that done and nothing of it. But in especially like SAFe, Scale Agile Framework, they tend to have develop the work and code and then test and then actually, release to the production when clients are actually using this feature, that's considered done. So you have to kind of work with kind of each team and organization to kind of set the standard of what they mean by done. Only then you're able to really kind of normalize that one point and then subsequent task and is referenced to that one point.
Yeah.
So 2 points would be twice as hard and longer to do than this 1 point task. And so on and so
different
on.
teams use
Using
a
the-
different scale,
yeah.
right?
And
So some
using
use
the
one, others use three.
Fibonacci-
Yeah.
Yes, using the Fibonacci sequence, right? So you have to kind of almost re-educate them from scratch. It is very difficult task when people have a certain wrong way of doing it already, but you have to somehow, try to help them start from scratch, basically, by re-educating them what 1 point means. Yeah.
Did that help, Khalid? I sure hope so.
Yeah, I did. Thank you for
Okay.
that.
Cool.
You're
'Cause,
welcome.
you have,
Thanks.
it's always like, a disagreement between this several parties. So it's good to know what logic people use to help change that behavior. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
That brings me to before we dive too deep in to the story point conversation, because I a little bit up in the chat, I know Brianna shared a couple of great anti-patterns too that I want to address. So I am going to do not the next, but the next session on story points, just because, like I see, it's a hot topic for conversation. And there was a question here: what does 1 point mean? And there's no simple answer. So let's do a session on story points. I think that's that would be very cool. So yeah,
Story
Brianna,
pointing is one of the hard concept for everyone to understand.
yeah.
So,
yeah.
so, even when you're trying to get the teams to get on board Agile, right? I think Scrum is the easiest, right? You just kind of go for a few minutes and then like everyone is on, everyone gets to align, right?
Yeah,
And
story
then
points take longer.
and then the retrospective, and then like sprint planning, because of the story pointing, becomes almost like the last thing because there's a lot of education involved and training,
Yeah.
So I think the talk on story point, it will be very, very extremely helpful. Yeah.
Let's do it for the next one. So Brianna said Scrum is a good fit for all teams, and Scrum is only for software development. Like, they sound sort of contradictory, but I do think I know what you mean, right? Some say like it's for all, and some say it's only for software development. Would you care to elaborate a little bit on?
Well, so far the examples you gave are all about Scrum, and Scrum is not the only framework in Agile, and we didn't dive into other practices outside of Scrum. And I've worked with a lot of teams where Scrum is a disaster, and have very little say in how you get to implement the framework. Like if you have high variability, or you're dependent on, if you have full functionality on your team and you own the full scope of what is trying to be delivered, it can work very well. So in software development, Like if there's not high variability, or if you have low interdependency, it's fantastic. It can be a disaster, and if that is not what you have, and likewise, like if you are constantly involved in firefighting, which is more of an organizational issue than it is so much of a practice, an agile practice, but like Scrum won't mean anything. You're going to consistently run into difficulties with the ceremonies or the events actually helping you deliver what your intended goal is.
Right. Yeah. Totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
then,
so,
go ahead.
and what are teams that you've seen where Scrum doesn't work? Is that those firefighting teams or any other teams?
No, so I have a Kanban team, and we were forced back into Scrum, and it caused disasters for us and our
Oh, yeah.
delivery. We missed everything. So we went as soon as the manager quit. We didn't wait. The minute he left he hadn't even left the building, we switched ourselves back to Kanban.
And rightly so.
Yeah. So and yeah, it does help because I'm dependent on no less than 7 teams delivering together for something to actually work, and there is a
Right.
high variation in the amount of work and the amount of knowledge work where I can't figure out like pointing or estimating or anything like that.
Right. Yeah.
It won't help us progress. So there are, there are other practices we use as well, but by making ourselves a Kanban team, we were able to still practice Agile, but fit something that's more relevant to what we will help us continuously deliver.
Yeah, and I think the overall anti-pattern there is a team not using a tool that works for them, but something that's being forced on them, right? Like you have to use Scrum, or you have to use Safe, or you have to use Kanban. Like it never really works like that. Okay, awesome. Let's see, what else is in the chat? Yeah, Brianna, you also said escalation is bad. I'm curious about that one too.
So a lot of times I recognize that teams, you have teams pitted against each other, and it's because you have low context to the situation of why a priority exists, right? And so using escalation can be your friend when you have people who are designated decision makers. They are forced to discuss. We mentioned at the product owner, but a lot of times the decisions are made well in advance, and if you've got profit loss responsibilities, you should be invested in how decisions are made. And so I regularly use this as a tool because I regularly get handed situations where like all of the architectural decisions have been made, and it's just up to me to execute something, right? And it's
Wow.
this is the disaster for the organization. This puts us at risk, and I'm not going, just because you've admitted the team handing it to me has mitigated their risk. Does that mean I'm willing to take it on? It means we need to legitimately make a better decision for the entire organization. And so by using this tactic of, forcing it back up, we don't have a scaled framework in place. So basically we're still at best doing Agile at the team level. But this pushes it back to decision makers that you just still, you have to make decisions. You have to be invested in your teams and understand that if someone is identifying a risk on one team, but it's not considered a risk on another team, like it needs clarification, and there needs to be some degree of discussion. And this also collides more with organizational design than it does necessarily with
Yes.
Agile.
Yeah. Yeah, but you are going to run into that at some point. If you're good at being agile, like you're always going to bump into that, to one or the other management layer where people have not yet changed their behavior and their mindset, and they're still running a traditionally, still making those long-term, early on decisions that are then being forced upon the teams, as you've mentioned. So yeah, very, very good share. Very good share. Absolutely. All right. So any other anti-patterns? I do want to steer clear a little bit of story point discussion because that's sort of Pandora's box. We could talk about that for 2 more hours. I want to see if there's any other anti-patterns out there, and then we'll bench the story points for a future
Yeah,
session.
I'm just kind of curious to hear how do you story point then, if there's no reference point, right?
You don't.
I mean, like, I don't have to.
No, you said you're
point
on
of story
Kanban,
pointing
right?
is
You're
yeah.
on Kanban style?
Well, I've done it. I've eliminated story pointing for both Scrum and Kanban, and also as well work groups that just use Agile practices. Like it's only a statement of probability, and you're only trying to figure out how you can deliver work in an increment.
Yep.
Like if you've got high variability, sometimes that's just not something you're going to be able to determine. And so the way we figured it out is how do we deliver the most value, actually we phrase it as success for our customers, because I don't care about value, I care about success. If my customer is not successful, then it doesn't matter what the value is, right? So breaking it enough down that we can deliver it in either through, like a set window of time, right? And that is enough for me to continuously to be able to deliver and meet releases.
Yeah, if you do Kanban and you're good at that, you really don't need story points anymore. It's just going to be like a huge
you don't
distraction.
use story points for Kanban.
There's much better metrics to measure if you're doing Kanban. More effective too. There's so much. There's a book by Daniel Vacanti. I'm not sure what the name is anymore, but it's a book on Kanban, and it's really full of things you can measure, and it's all empirical. And you don't even need to go into concepts like story points that are not. They're not part of Scrum and not even mandatory, right? Story pointing is just a practice you can use, and some organizations are really successful with story points. And I know for my own time as an engineer, they have really helped us tremendously back then. But other teams in the organization use Kanban and different metrics, so it's really your mileage may vary. Yeah, and Omoye, again, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing all the names correctly. If not, my apologies. Story points are not in the Scrum Guide. It's really a complementary practice that Agile teams may use if it fits their need. Yeah, there's other team things too. All right, any other thoughts or anti-patterns that people want to share?
I did throw in there also, we kind of loosely touched on it, but velocity as a management tool, it is reflecting on, burn down charts or burn up charts if you need those for what you do, and being pitted against other teams for how fast or how well you can deliver. And especially if you don't use it, or you're in a very competitive environment, or it's just again, organizational issues about what is considered valued. I recognize how this happens, because when management is also novice to Agile, like they need some kind of visualization to be able to determine how is a team succeeding, especially if you're responsible for a wide berth of teams. It can be very, very difficult, and the easiest.
Yeah, what do you measure? Right, that's the biggest question.
All these dashboards, yeah, and that is not a reflection. And it has led to excruciating pain when being, a team. Like I had a team, at best, we could deliver in a sprint 11 points. My boss, who also had a team, was delivering 120 plus points. My team never, ever had a bug or defect. And we consistently released, and when we released into production, there were never issues, and someone can use it immediately. Team that was consistent with defects and bugs, and the work had to be reworked constantly, but they were always considered a bright shining star, and they actually were only doing waterfall every 2 weeks, and they weren't actually delivering anything to make the teams or the organization successful because of the amount of rework that had to be done.
Yeah, and that's a funny thing about user stories, with the risk of going down that path, right? It's an arbitrary skill. You can set the skill yourself. So if management wants you to double your velocity when you're using story points, you just double the skill and you're there. Like I've literally had to do this once. There was so much pressure. Like we have to increase. All right, let's double it. And then we doubled it. And that was all okay, right? So, and it's really a farce, because it's not what you want to measure, right? You want to measure valuable outcomes, customer success, or anything else, right? But not velocity. That's really not what it's for. Right.
Yeah, I think one other thing in terms of like writing story points is when they like make the story point more of a task versus a story. So like the development use story, and then the QA story will happen in the next sprint, versus you're not actually completing a complete piece of work that you can release.
Wow, yeah, that's another perfect waterfall example. It's like, yeah, let's do development this sprint, and then let's do testing next sprint. That could bring us even to those bug sprints, right? Where you all you do is like fix bugs. And I have to admit, I did one of those in like 7 years ago or 8 years ago as well, because there was like so much wrong with our software. But yeah, sometimes you're being forced to do this, but you want to stay away from that as much as you can, right? You want to deliver value and make sure you do it in the sprint, and value is tested. And I think to a point Samantha made before, it does depend on the definition of done teams have, right? But to a certain point, testing is kind of key, regardless of who does it before you ship something out. Yeah. Cool. All right. So if people want to share more, that's fine if we want to hang around for conversation, but I do want to be conscious of the time. So just in case you do need to drop off again, I'll share the recording and the slides on the Meetup page tomorrow. Next meeting is going to be July 7th, 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 Central, and you can fill out Mountain and Pacific. Introduction to OKRs. So we're going to be talking about OKRs. And then 3 weeks later, it's going to be on story points, and that'll work. OKRs, really a hot topic recently, objective key results. Some misconceptions out there as well. I had it lined up for a blog post anyway, so one-on-one or two. So very excited to be talking about that and seeing what the value is, what it is, what is being used for, and hopefully it'll be helpful. So again, thank you all for being here. I'm going to wrap the recording right now. If you do have any questions or comments you want to share, feel free to do so and stick around. If not, thanks for being here and have a wonderful rest of your day.